So I was scrolling through Twitter the other day and I came across this tweet and I thought it was pretty funny. But also it made me think, what is Warner Brothers' issue with Superman? And why aren't they able to just make a solo movie with this guy anymore? I mean, Superman is one of the most famous superheroes, but now he's just a headless cameo that pops up in movies and TV shows every few years. I mean, it's kind of hard to believe that we've got 3 versions of Spider-Man running around the MCU. Next year we'll have 3 live-action versions of Batman in 2 different live-action franchises. But as of right now, at least in the DCEU, Superman is a non-entity. So I guess the best place to start is at the beginning. Where did things start to go wrong for Warner Brothers and Superman? Man of Steel was the first film Warner Brothers launched in their cinematic DC universe, and pretty much from the second trailer, I was nervous about the direction that Snyder was taking the character in. In particular, it was this exchange.
What was I supposed to do? Just let him die?
Maybe.
Once I heard that line from Jonathan Kent, I knew this wasn't going to be the version of Superman that I wanted to see. Superman gets his morals from his parents, Jonathan and Martha Kent, so it was a little jarring hearing Pa Kent basically Clark Kent's moral compass, telling him that maybe it would have been better if he'd let a bunch of school kids die rather than save them, just in case they gave away his secret. Snyder's casting of Henry Cavill was brilliant. He couldn't have gotten a guy who looked more like Superman, but where Snyder started to go wrong was with the characterization of Clark Kent Superman. Snyder's Superman doesn't embody the traits that make Superman feel like Superman, his optimism, his hopefulness, his good-natured spirit. All of that is thrown out in Man of Steel, and instead it's replaced by dourness and this sense of joylessness. Snyder's Superman is a totally new character, and one that audiences didn't really connect with. Another problem with this version of Superman is that there isn't any establishment of the Clark Kent persona. We get glimpses of it in Man of Steel, but it doesn't get any real development outside of a few scenes with Martha Kent and Lois. The relationship between Clark Kent and Lois, and also Clark and the Daily Planet staff, is totally gone. By the time we get to Batman v Superman, Clark and Lois have already moved in together. The Clark Kent side of the character is totally an afterthought in this film and in the series overall. And this is a really big mistake because the Clark Kent persona is critical to the Superman character. His relationship with Lois, his mom and dad, and his friends at the Daily Planet, that's where you see the kind of guy that Clark Kent is. You need this stuff for the audience to connect to the character. The Donner films really excelled at this. You got to see Superman, but you also got to see Clark Kent too. You got to see both sides of the character, and both were equally as important. Here's an example. Imagine if you cut out 90% of the Peter Parker scenes from the first Sam Raimi Spider-Man movie. All that stuff with Aunt May, Uncle Ben, Mary Jane, and Harry, and replaced it with basically nothing, and you get my point. It would be a lot harder to connect with that version of Peter Parker because you'd have no idea what his character is all about. That wouldn't work for a character like Spider-Man, and it really doesn't work for Superman either. There's a reason why the Superman and Lois show focuses so much on Clark's life outside of the costume. Reinvention is a fine thing, and sometimes it's necessary, but Superman didn't need to be changed, and certainly not to the degree he was in Man of Steel. Putting a grim dour filter over Clark Kent's personality was never going to work, and if there's one character you should probably never try something like this with, it's Superman. The general consensus from Man of Steel from the fans was that while the action was pretty good, it was way too dour, it was way too dark, the colour palette was washed out, and the main character was basically unrecognisable as Superman. And here's where Warner Brothers will go on to make their next big mistake. They don't take any of this feedback into account when starting work on the sequel. All the problems that people had with Man of Steel, yeah, Warner Brothers are just going to double down on all of those for the sequel, and instead of deciding on a strategy for what to do with the character in the next movie, Superman will be pushed to the background in BVS and will only get a total of 43 lines of dialogue in the whole film. And once Batman v Superman comes out, that's the last real thing Warner Brothers will do with the character of Superman. From here on out, Superman is no longer a priority for the studio. Fast forward to September 12th, 2018, and The Hollywood Reporter releases an article that Cavill has left the role. Warner Brothers have never officially said he's out though, and Cavill has expressed plenty of interest in coming back for future films. And that's it. That's where things stood for 4 years, in this weird limbo state. What's Cavill's status in the DCEU? Is he in? Is he out? I couldn't tell you. It's been 4 years. Superman is now a headless cameo in the DCEU, but Warner Brothers are just happy to keep on rolling with that. I mean, can you imagine how badly you have to mess up a contract negotiation with an actor that this is the only thing you can do with the character they play? How badly would a company have to be this mismanaged that this is the only option they have left with one of their most important characters. Can you imagine Marvel doing something like this with one of their characters? Like say if negotiations went bad with Chris Evans, and instead of Marvel recasting the character, they basically just made Captain America a headless cameo for 4 years? I think the higher-ups at Warner Brothers have this idea that Superman is kind of old hat. He's too much of a Boy Scout, and he's just not relevant to today's audiences. That's why you're seeing Superman snapping necks now, and why every other iteration of the character is this evil god type. It's because Warner Brothers think people will take more to that than they would the classic version of Superman they saw in the Donner films and the cartoons. They think Superman needs an edge for audiences to take him seriously. What Warner Brothers never really understood, and still kind of fails to understand, is that you don't need to change the character of Superman so drastically for him to get over with audiences. You actually don't need to change the character at all. There isn't a fundamental problem with the character of Superman. There's only a problem with the way the character is written for these movies. People like Superman, they just don't like this reinterpretation of the character. Marvel understood this with their characters. They kind of lasered in on what the fundamental appeal of a character was and why the character endured for so long in the comics, and then put those qualities on the screen. Marvel understood you don't need to change Captain America for him to work on the big screen. The character works just fine the way he is. So what is the future for Superman on the big screen? Well, that's a pretty complicated question. In February 2021, Warner Bros. Announced a new Superman project written by Ta-Nehisi Coates, focusing on a different version of Clark Kent Superman, who's a black man living in early 20th century America. There's also another Superman project with Michael B. Jordan attached in some capacity, focusing on what is probably Val Zod. It was also rumored that Superman was totally written out of the DCEU in the Flashpoint movie, and that the focus was going to be on Supergirl going forward. And it's Warner Brothers, so who knows if any of these projects will ever see the light of day. Coates' Superman project was announced over a year ago, and nothing's really been heard about it since, outside of a rumour in April that he's about to turn in the first draft of the script. Nothing's been heard about Michael B. Jordan's project either. Factoring in the Warner Brothers Discovery merger and Zaslav cleaning house on a lot of these in-development projects, I wouldn't hold my breath on ever actually seeing any of these films, which is a shame. I think Michael B. Jordan as Val Zod could have been great. While I like the idea of Warner Bros. Exploring their characters with different actors and in different settings and time periods, Coates' Superman project doesn't feel creatively motivated to me in the same way that Michael B. Jordan's Val Zod project does. It feels again more like Warner Bros. Scrambling to change the character of Superman in an attempt to make him more relevant or more interesting, which is actually the same mistake they've made with Superman from the start, trying to do something radically different with the character than just adapting the original version first. Coates' Superman movie sounds more like a pitch for an Icon movie than a Superman film. This again goes back to Warner Brothers not actually listening to what people want. From everything I've seen online, no one wants to see Cavill recast. They want a soft reboot of Superman, yes, but with Cavill continuing on in the role. Superman in the DCU has had some pretty poor films, but no one has an issue with Cavill as Superman. They have an issue with the characterization, but not with Cavill himself. Cavill's Superman has always had the potential to be great with the right material. People want to see him get that opportunity to do Superman justice. If you recast him, you're actually doing the exact opposite of what people want, which I guess is in keeping with Warner Brothers' can't learn, won't learn approach to the DCEU. But there is some good news. After the Warner Brothers Discovery merger, it's been reported that the higher-ups at Warner Brothers want to push characters they feel have been left to languish under the previous administration. More recently, there's been a lot of hints from therock that Henry Cavill is back in the role of Superman for a cameo in Black Adam, and apparently this was all at the insistence of therock himself. He had to force Warner Brothers into using the character. It took him 6 years of negotiations, and it was only then possible because the previous higher-ups in Warner Brothers were shuffled out of the company. Can you imagine how badly your company is being run when one of your big-name actors has to force you into using a character people actually want to see? A character that there is actual demand for. I really don't understand the problems Warner Brothers has. It sounds like from some of the interviews therock's given that Superman will be put back into the DCU in a big way, so a solo Superman film isn't totally implausible now. So here's a 2-step plan that Warner Brothers can have for free so that they don't totally make a mess of Superman on the second attempt. Step 1. Throw out everything that has come before, and I mean all of it. Man of Steel all the way up to Justice League, or Zack Snyder's Justice League, whichever one of these films is canon. All that stuff is just baggage and you don't need it. Start totally fresh. It doesn't need to be a Superman origin story, but it does need to be an origin for a new version of Superman. Establish Superman as a hopeful figure. Lean into the core aspects of the character, the optimism, the hopefulness. Lean into the supporting cast. Flesh out the relationship Clark has with his mom and dad, his friends at the Daily Planet, and Lois. And also, sorry Jesse Eisenberg, you're out as Lex Luthor, that role's going to need to be recast. Update the costume with a more traditional look, no more washed out colours. Step 2. This is the second chance, so Warner Brothers can't afford to blow it again by getting the characterization wrong. Getting the right director and writer is crucial. They need to understand the character, and even more importantly, they need to appreciate the character. Ideally, you need someone who will do for Superman what Matt Reeves did for Batman. Someone like a Brad Bird or a Matthew Vaughn would be a great get. Take inspiration from what's working. The new Superman and Lois show does a perfect job of getting the character of Superman right. And there you have it. It's not rocket science. You don't need to reinvent the wheel with this one. Over the course of 9 years since Man of Steel was released, through a combination of mismanagement, lack of direction, and no imagination, Warner Brothers have managed to take one of their most promising IPs, Superman, and reduce him down to a headless cameo that only appears in other characters' movies and TV shows. That's pretty impressive considering that in the same amount of time, Marvel have managed to turn some of their B and C tier characters into household names. The only thing that has ever stood in the way of Superman being one of the biggest superhero properties is the studio that owns him. I can only hope that Warner Brothers get out of their own way, learn from their previous mistakes, and give this character the fair shake he deserves. As always, thanks for watching.